I'm gonna call this Min C for the rest of the video, or Maxx under the sea. In case you're not caught up on the news, yesterday, as a part of the Infinite Forbidden spoiler season, a new card was revealed that looks a lot like Maxx C if you squint your eyes. This is a level 4 water aqua effect monster, 100 attack, 600 defense. During the turn you activate this card's effect, you can only activate one Molt Chummy monster effect, not counting this card's. If you control no cards, you can discard this card, apply these